So I joined the Army, I enlisted in the Army in 1995 with the sole intent of serving a few years and getting out and becoming a police officer. And then the Army gives you tests, and they give you a sense of what you can and can't do, jobs that you can have, and one of the jobs that was open to me was an Arabic linguist. And again, in 1995, the Army had ramped up all of its Arabic program based on the first Gulf War in 1990. By the time in 1995, there wasn't a huge need for Arabic linguists, but they were still training us. So I did my 5 years in the Army as an Arabic linguist. I traveled to Egypt and a few other minor deployments. And in 2000, September of 2000, I was honorably discharged. And there was no reason to stay in the Army as an Arabic linguist in 2000. The Middle East looked generally quiet. Things looked peaceful. There didn't seem to be any. I spent my 5 years training for war, jumping out of planes and helicopters and swamps but never anything real. And so I got out and I found my job as a policeman. And it was a beautiful thing. And police work, and I know that's a controversial, it's become a little bit more controversial now. If police work is done right, it can be a ministry. You are called to people at the lowest point, usually in their lives, and you have an absolute opportunity to minister to these people in crisis. And if you arrive on a scene, whether it be a domestic dispute or a car accident or someone has overdosed, whatever it is, if you arrive on scene with the idea of protecting that person, literally kind of protecting them in their worst moment, you can do amazing things. And I was trained by some officers who did just that. And it really was a beautiful thing. I was also exposed to officers who did not respond that way. And these are the officers that are making the news. So you get called to, say, a domestic dispute, and you would ask for another officer to come. And you knew, based on which officer was assigned as your backup, which way that call was going to go. You knew right away that if a certain officer was coming, things were going to be great. And you couldn't wait for him or her to get there, and it was going to get better and they would be helpful. But then you also knew that there was another kind of officer that got called. And if their badge number got called and was coming, you knew it was going to be a long night. And there were just certain guys that just had a desire to sort of ramp people up and make things ugly. And this is, I know this is a topic you could probably have a whole forum on, is law enforcement. And so I was at the beginning of my career, and I was enjoying it, and I was learning a lot. And again, as a sense of calling, I felt that I had fulfilled my calling, was ready for the next step or whatever it was. And I'd received a job offer with a federal law enforcement agency, and I had to go down to Philadelphia to have a medical exam, and my heart condition was diagnosed. I was not symptomatic. I had no idea. I had no idea that I had what was called a cardiomyopathy. It was this enlarged, leaking heart that was beating wrong. And so everything ended at once. The police job was gone. Any sense of ever moving into any kind of law enforcement position was gone. I certainly couldn't go back to the Army. All of it was over. Meanwhile, at that exact same time, we were invading Iraq. This was post 9/11. And I was desperate to get back into some kind of law enforcement role, whatever it was, some kind of way to sort of salvage what I felt that I had lost. Now, I wasn't listening to smart voices anymore. I wasn't taking counsel from people who had counseled me for years and years. I just wanted what I wanted. And the one way to get back into the war, which again I felt connected to because I had been a soldier, was this new concept, or not new concept, but contracting on a large scale. Certainly the Army has always contracted before for things like food service and trucking and those types of things, but the idea that they were contracting for things like interrogation and intelligence analysis and security was new. And so it was a door that was wide open to me. They did not have any kind of medical exam or any kind of, there was really no background check. They never even spoke to my supervisors at the police department. So I filled out the right paperwork. I was hired within a week. 2 or 3 weeks later, I was in Texas. I flew to Kuwait. And a day or two after that, I was in Baghdad. And January 2004, I got put in a car, and they said, you're going to go to Abu Ghraib. And none of us knew really what Abu Ghraib was. The photos hadn't been published yet, and certainly no one knew what was going on there. I was aware that it was a large prison out in between Fallujah and Baghdad. I'd heard of the prison before, but certainly had no idea what I was getting myself into. I could speak for hours about what happened next and what eventually went on in Fallujah. But the war in Iraq at that point was being painted as a dying insurgency. They weren't even using the word insurgency at this point. They were saying, it was in its last throes, those sorts of things. It was a raging combat zone. Iraq was on fire in early 2004. Hundreds of Iraqis were dying daily. They hadn't quite devised the IED at that point. They were using them. They were using old artillery rounds, putting them on the side of the road. They hadn't gotten the timing down. They weren't that sophisticated. So the IEDs went off frequently, but they were more of a joke at that point. You would often, American convoys would drive by, and you'd see the explosion in your rearview mirror, right? This was the IED in 2004. Most of the casualties at this point were mortar rounds and incoming rockets. Saddam Hussein just had this enormous stockpile of mortars and rockets, and so they simply fired them onto American bases. But as far as what was going on inside Iraq in terms of the Sunni and the Shia, they were slaughtering each other at will. And these are the people that we were getting into the interrogation rooms, and we were still tasked with finding chemical weapons, but we were also tasked with then finding a way of what was going on in Iraq. Why are these people killing each other? Why aren't they kind of accepting our presence, and why aren't they happy that Saddam is gone? And so into that chaos, they threw people like me, and people like me made the horrific mistake of using what we were then calling enhanced interrogation techniques, which we all now know to be torture. That went on for about 3 months for me. I did it at Abu Ghraib, I did it at Fallujah, and then that was enough. And on some level I say I did it on a very limited basis, but it was enough to involve myself in that process. The 10 years that followed have been kind of this desperate effort for me to put those pieces back together. Writing has certainly been part of it, counseling has been part of that, but also kind of just sort of processing out loud with my wife and close friends about how to do this. And one of the communities that I have tried to process with has been my church. And trying to find out why was I either not paying attention to the kind of messages you gave this evening, or was I simply not hearing them, or was it not being said? What I would have given to have heard that kind of message after 9/11. And that's not to suggest that at my Presbyterian church people were standing up and applauding war, but there was not an instant move to peace. And I was someone who was as guilty as anyone in wanting revenge, which is what led me there. I'm going to read three passages from the book that no one on the radio ever asks me to read, and it's because they're about the faith issues. So I'm not going to read anything about torture, but I think it's fair that I admit to those who may not know me well that yes, I was absolutely involved in some incredibly abusive things. This first scene comes, I'm at Abu Ghraib, I'd been there for just a day or two, and I was scheduled for my first interrogation. So, excuse me. It is Sunday. I'm scheduled to conduct my first interrogation. The Army has set up a room full of computers adjacent to the dining facility where soldiers can access email and internet. The Army calls this an internet cafe, but it is nothing more than a bunch of dusty desks and old Dell computers. I stand in line for 15 minutes of my internet time. It's just enough to download one email from my sister. My 4-year-old nephew had to be taken to the emergency room. He stuck a bean up his nose and couldn't blow it out. 30 miles away in Baghdad, a suicide bomber detonates a vehicle and kills more than 20 Iraqis. From the internet cafe, I walk to the ICE, which is the interrogation control element. There is a large expanse of macadam where Army helicopters land to deliver the prisoners. I watch a mushroom cloud rise above the walls of Abu Ghraib as ordnance disposal teams detonate an IED. I pass by the makeshift chapel. I have time for the opening hymn, and I sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds." I place the hymnal under the folding chair and reach for my body armor. I work the Velcro straps on the armor as slowly as possible so as not to disturb other worshipers, but the straps make a terrible tearing sound. On my way to the ICE, the interrogation control element, I stop and rest near the HESCO barriers near Camp Gansey, which are large anti-blast walls. I pray. I've not pursued prayer in some time, but as I sit in a prison in Iraq and prepare to interrogate prisoners of war, it seems appropriate to pray to God. Presbyterians are taught to pray with the Lord's Prayer in mind. We begin with praise, then move on to requests and confessions, before closing with words of thanks. My prayer outside Camp Gansi, which is a small camp of prisoners inside Abu Ghraib, my prayer ends quickly. As I move towards requests, I feel a terrible sense of shame. I cannot ask God to accompany me into an interrogation booth. In Scripture, God often works in prisons, but he is never on the side of the jailer. He is always on the side of the prisoner. The realization brings on a physical reaction. My hands shake, my face warms, I feel nauseated. The sensation is terrifying. Prayer in Iraq is dangerous. I'm beginning to realize that I'm not on God's path, I'm on my own. Go ahead.
Do you feel that there are some times where torture is possibly necessary in regards to what the possible information may be obtained in order to save people who could be at threat because of that, because of the possible information that may be derived from torture?
Not based on the way I read the Constitution and things like the Bill of Rights. I think that discussion can also very quickly lead into, is torture effective? Can you actually even gain information? And I'm at odds with a lot of people on that, and saying, and I say in the book that yes, you can gain information from torture. It's been used since really the beginning of time. I think you can make a much stronger argument that you can gain a lot more information by not using it. But this is a discussion that I simply don't involve myself in anymore. It's not about whether it's effective. It's not about what you can find. It's not even about whether or not you're protecting the American people. It's about whether it's right or wrong, and it's wrong. I took an oath. I swore an oath as a soldier. I raised my right hand on the Bible. I swear to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I never swore to defend the people of the United States. I never swore to defend the World Trade Center. I didn't swear to defend, the Midwest. I swore to defend the Constitution, and it's something that makes the American military unique. And so, again, torture simply, and if the word torture is what the hang-up is, then the aggressive treatment of a prisoner of war violates the values that we find in the Constitution. I don't know if anybody remembers the preamble from Schoolhouse Rock. Did anyone listen to Schoolhouse Rock, right? Right, the preamble, right? It's right there. It's right in the beginning, So, it's a violation of the Constitution for me.
You mentioned a little bit about, coming back and independence, the very specific things people did in the Crusades. But in terms of the church not being able to handle it, is there something, looking back, how would you teach the church? What would you say?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I think it involves the whole process. And I think the church has to, if it has members of its congregations that are going to join the military and go off to war, it needs to prepare them beforehand. It's a raw kind of thought process right now, but it has to be something along the lines of, you will sin as a soldier or a Marine, and we will love you when you get back, but you will have to deal with this sin, and we will have to deal with this sin, right? We're in some way sending you because we think the Constitution is being threatened somewhere. But no matter how righteous or just that cause may seem, you will sin in the process of accomplishing that task. And I think if my own church or even some of my dear or close friends had said that to me in kind of as I prepared to go, I wonder if I wouldn't have been a little bit more prepared to deal with some of the things that happened coming back. And maybe even more prepared to deal with my own actions on the battlefield. So.